The acting commissioner for the Suffolk County Police Department is holding a briefing about the crash that injured an officer early this morning. Let's listen in.
To talk about the disturbing events that happened last night. And I have to say that last night our department, and I'll extend that to our entire county because of the support our department has from Suffolk County, narrowly avoided a tragedy. We came very close to losing the life of one of our members. And it's happened before, far too often, and the events of last night really highlight again to me something that I know very well. Law enforcement is a very, very dangerous profession. So the reason that our officer is still with us today, certainly there was some luck. I'll talk about the circumstances of the accident, and certainly some luck came into play with that. But certainly the circumstances involved great collaboration, which I'll speak about, talent, and great resources that the Suffolk County possesses. Last night, the Ridge Fire Department came out to the accident scene, and again, I'll talk about the circumstances of the accident. You know, I'm always impressed with the volunteer fire service that they're willing to leave their homes, in this case in the middle of the night, to basically help strangers. So the Ridge Fire Department came out and they worked collaboratively with paramedics from our department, EMTs from our department, from our medical crisis action team, to provide on-scene care to our police officer that was injured in this accident. One of our helicopters responded. Our county is very lucky to have the medevac program that we do. We have 2 medevac bases. One is 24/7, one is 16/7. And our medevac program is a collaboration with Stony Brook University Hospital. Both of our medevac helicopters have a paramedic on station with us, 16 hours a day or 24 hours a day, depending on which base, from Stony Brook Hospital. So the medevac hospital responded, and as a result, we were able to fly our injured officer to Stony Brook Hospital. From the scene, our police officers, the paramedics, contacted Dr. James Voswinkle, our medical director, who's also the chief of trauma surgery at Stony Brook Hospital. So that call was able to put the machine in motion at Stony Brook Hospital, so they were prepared for our officer's arrival. So that collaboration, that talent, those resources, that's really, I believe, what saved our officer from potentially dying last night. You know, and unfortunately, in my job here, I've met a great many of our police officers, really great young police officers, in circumstances almost exactly like this. They were traumatically injured at work, and they very likely would have died had it not been for this collaboration, these talent, and these resources, especially Stony Brook Hospital. You know, recently we've had police officer Nick Guerrera, who was hit by a car. We've had police officer Mark Collins, who was shot. We've had Christian Vidal, a 3rd precinct officer that was involved in an early morning accident with a drunk driver. And most recently, Chris Rassiopo, who was stabbed and lost all his blood. All 4 of those officers and numerous others have gone to Stony Brook Hospital, and the great care that they've received at Stony Brook Hospital, I truly believe, have saved their lives. Nick Guerrera, Mark Collins, Christian Vidal, and Chris Rassiopo have not only recovered, they've all been able to return to work. You know, and that's one of the things that I made very clear to the family of this injured officer, that he was in no greater hands than Stony Brook University Hospital, and it was my belief, I was very optimistic, that he had the same chance that these officers had, that he could potentially fully recover and return to work. So all too often I've had to go to Stony Brook Hospital, and I can say many of the faces in the emergency room are familiar to me. I know many of the names, unfortunately, because I've been there so frequently with our officers that have been injured. But it's very disturbing to have to look into the pained and agonized faces of our young officers. And in this case, that was certainly the case last night. This officer was in extreme pain when he initially was brought to Stony Brook Hospital. And it's also very concerning to see how traumatized his family is. His wife, his parents. You know, it's difficult to be a police officer, but it's also incredibly difficult to be a police family. And you can imagine his wife, and they do have young children, and his parents at home late at night, and they get a call from our department, and someone comes and picks them up to inform them that their spouse, their son, the father of children, the father of grandchildren has been seriously injured and has been brought to Stony Brook Hospital. You can imagine that trauma. And then to see how seriously injured he is in person when they arrive, how traumatic that is. Police work, you know, you could say, well, what the officer was doing is routine, but police work is never routine. There's a danger, there's an element of danger to every single thing we do. The officer last night was on a traffic post. You could say directing traffic is a very routine thing to do, but of course there's a tremendous element of danger, especially when you're directing traffic on a high-speed roadway late at night when there's a greater prevalence of drunk and impaired drivers, and that's exactly what came into play last night. So I'm not going to release the name of our officer at this point. We will release him down the line. The reason for that is, as Dr. Voswinkle, I'll introduce him and he can talk about his care. The officer suffered a serious head injury. He needed brain surgery last night. He's sedated and on a ventilator now. I'd like to have his young children have the opportunity to see their father and speak to him before we release his name so that they can be reassured that he's going to be fine. We have every belief that he will be fine, but I would like his children to be able to see him and talk to him before we do release his name. So our officer, he's a 7th Precinct Patrol officer. He's assigned to patrol. He's been a member of our department for about 3 years. He's received several letters from the community commending him for his actions. His commanding officer, his lieutenant, and his sergeant all told me what a great young officer he is. He does a phenomenal job for our department. So he's a great asset to us. He's a great asset to Suffolk County. He was on a traffic post closing William Floyd Parkway southbound. He was north of the Long Island Expressway at Yaphank Woods Boulevard. There had been an earlier accident. We were in the process of determining if that accident involved physical injury or serious physical injury. If it had involved serious physical injury, we would have processed a crime scene. So we had the roadway closed while we were making that determination. Fortunately, that prior accident only involved physical injury, so we did not need to process a crime scene. At that particular juncture, what the officer was doing, he had his car, his patrol car, blocking the road with the lights on. He also had a flare line across the road. He was forcing traffic to either make a right onto Yaphank Woods Boulevard or to make a U-turn to return northbound on William Floyd Parkway. At some point, a citizen driving a Yukon, a GMC Yukon, stopped to ask the officer something. He was in the process at the time of replacing the flare line, so he was a short distance from the Yukon. Shortly after the Yukon stopped, a William Peterson in a 1999 Chevrolet pickup truck traveling southbound on William Floyd Parkway crashed into the GMC Yukon. The Yukon had been parked not parallel to William Floyd Parkway, it had been parked at an angle to William Floyd Parkway. So the impact spun that vehicle around, and the Yukon struck our police officer, and he ended up underneath the Yukon. The pickup continued on and hit our marked patrol car. So again, he suffered very serious injuries as a result of the accident. Ridge Fire Department responded. They worked on him with paramedics from our Medical Crisis Action Team and police officers from the 7th Precinct. So I want to commend who did a phenomenal job. Without the chain of events that occurred last night, it's entirely possible that this officer would have suffered a much more serious outcome, even potentially passing away, which Dr. Voss will speak about. He was transported in Ridge ambulance to our helicopter. Our helicopter flew him to Stony Brook. And I can't say enough again about Stony Brook. The level of care there was just phenomenal. I've seen it over and over again. I saw it firsthand again last night. They were monitoring his head injury, and at some point they made a determination that he needed surgery, and he was rushed into surgery. There was a neurosurgeon there that could immediately care for him, but I'm going to let Dr. Voswinkle speak about his care. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Voswinkle now to, again, he's our medical director, and he's the chief of trauma surgery at Stony Brook University. Doctor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Unfortunately, I'm up in front of you guys again talking. It was just a little bit less than 7 months ago, and some of the faces are familiar here, where Officer Rossioppo almost lost his life. I didn't expect to be in this situation so soon. Last night, once again, we almost lost one of the defenders of the county, the people who take care of us. As I've stated many times before, I'm a trauma surgeon. I work in a hospital. I'm protected. I'm not out in the streets. But we had someone out protecting us who almost lost his life. There's a statement in trauma. You get to the right place at the right time with the right person. Very, very, very important. What happened pre-hospital last night was beyond imperative, the way things went down. For the communication to happen, to identify the severity of injury that this officer had, the collaboration with volunteers, the medical training that is given to the Suffolk County Police with special units such as MedCat, where you have trained paramedics who provide advanced life support, the ability, as the commissioner said, to have additional flight paramedics to transport to the highest level is extremely important. When this officer came in, he had an obvious severe orthopedic injury. We were dealing with that. Very briefly, when we got him to imaging, we saw he had something called an epidural hematoma. An epidural hematoma is a life-threatening, fatal head injury. That black and white. You can look in the literature, you can see how, unfortunately, celebrities have died from epidural hematomas. Essentially, it's when an artery on the skull from a skull fracture starts bleeding, and you have pressurized bleeding in your brain, and if left untreated, patients very, very quickly die. That's the severity of injury we were talking about last night. You know, patients live through orthopedic injuries, but when you have this type of severity, it shows the impact this officer sustained. It shows what we were dealing with. Very fortunately, the team at Stony Brook, Dr. Michael Egnor from neurosurgery, came in-house. We worked together. We were able to decompress and evacuate the blood, stop the bleeding. As I said, the officer still has other injuries, but the life-threatening bleed has been taken care of. He is currently in our ICU, receiving minute-to-minute, high-level expert care by our nurses. As the commissioner said, he's asleep. People will call it a medically induced coma, whatever you want to call it. He's on the ventilator, and obviously we're watching and observing to make sure he recovers. So while we're all very, very optimistic for a good outcome, he still is critically ill overall.
Thank you, Doctor. Before I take questions, one thing I would ask that all the viewers keep our officer and his family in their thoughts and prayers. We're optimistic that he will fully recover. And again, that's due to the great care that he received both before he went to the hospital and at Stony Brook Hospital. Does anybody have any questions?
We appreciate you explaining exactly what kind of injuries he sustained. Thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you about the gentleman who hit him. Peterson, right, was the last name?
Peterson.
Where was he going before this? Where was he on his way to? Do we know anything about his priors, possibly?
My understanding is he has one prior for reckless driving. He has no drunk driving priors. I don't know where he was coming from or where he was going, other than the fact that he was going southbound of William Floyd Parkway when the accident occurred.
And what will he be charged with?
Right now, he's going to be charged with drunk driving. There's a high probability that those charges will be upgraded though.
Is he going to be in court soon, or?
He was seriously injured in the accident, so he's hospitalized right now, so he'll be arraigned at a later date. We did our major case section came out. The arrest was processed by a member of our safety team that's assigned to Highway Patrol. They're experts in making drunk driving arrests. And our major case detective squad is doing the investigation. They did get a search warrant for his blood, so his blood was taken last night.
Do we know any preliminary, like he was 2 times above the legal limit, 3 times, nothing like that yet? Okay.
How about the other driver, the one that pulled over to talk to the officer?
He was not injured in the accident, fortunately.
Doctor, can you go through the other injuries that the officer sustained and what the short-term work is that will need to be done to get him back to a full recovery?
Correct. So as you can imagine, when someone comes in this severely injured, we are rapidly trying to resuscitate and assess injuries. So even at this point in time, I can't tell you the full extent of his injuries because I have a patient who's asleep on a ventilator. We can't be able to do a full exam on him, looking for minor injuries from that perspective. What we've determined, as I said, besides his life-threatening hemorrhage, there is additional trauma that he has into his brain. He has facial fractures, obviously some lacerations, and he has a fracture to his humerus, which is his upper arm. As time goes on, we may find additional injuries, but just from the constellation so far, you can kind of understand the severity. And not to mince words, how someone really was looking out for him. To have a motor vehicle hit and to spin and to hit you with that type of force, when you're doing the right thing, I mean, you're standing there, you're protected, and that the car didn't roll over him, didn't hit additional issues, and that I can say here that we're optimistic, obviously for him to survive and to get through this. tremendously positive thing to say, because this could have turned out so much differently. And once again, to not being there, the timeliness, the way everything processed, from when he was hit to when he was in my resuscitation bay was less than 30 minutes. He was in a CAT scanner within 10 minutes. We identified the life-threatening hemorrhage that quickly. That's why you see a lot of people, unfortunately, die of these hemorrhages, because they don't get that type of care. They don't have the right person at the right place at the right time. So the team that occurred pre-hospitally, the communication with our center, where we obviously have the expertise to treat all comprehensive severe injuries, was paramount in the outcomes that we're going to have here. So why it's too soon to say what injuries he has or what his overall prognosis is, we are extremely grateful that we have, I don't want to say dodged a bullet, but that we have, got him to this point and that he's alive.
Seconds count.
In this case, it does. And the way the system worked was optimal. It really was the way things went down. Ideally, we'd like to see this with every patient. Unfortunately, that's what we always strive for in medicine. Every one of your colleagues who wakes up in the middle of the night to go out is doing it. Their heart's in it. They're helping people. Every doctor, nurse, therapist at this hospital, when we come in, as you can imagine, none of us are with sleep right now, for probably 30-something hours. But that's what we're here to do. That's why we put on our scrubs, we put on our uniforms, we get into our ambulances. We're here because, the world's unfortunately become too dangerous of a place.
Can you spell out your first name and last name?
James, James, V as in Victor, OSS, WINKEL.
And your title?
I am the medical director of the Suffolk County Police Department, and I am the trauma medical director of Stony Brook University Hospital.
I might have missed this. Obviously, I understand
No, please.
not releasing name, but did you say the age of the officer, or are you not releasing that either?
I didn't say his age, but PIO can let you know what his age is. They don't have that.
Okay.
Can you say how many years he was on the job?
3 years. He started with us in October of 2018. I'll give Dr. Haas one other title. He's the angel on our shoulders. He's intervened so many times with our officers, and he really deserves a lot of credit last night for spinning up the mechanism to save this officer. And of course, the first concern was that he would survive, but after he had the brain surgery, the hospital has such great resources. There was a plastic surgeon that could immediately step in and fix the facial injuries, which is, certainly less important than the brain surgery, but, of importance, so that while he was still in the operating room, that was able to be done. So I just can't thank Stony Brook Hospital enough. They should receive great credit for saving many of our officers. So thank you all for coming today.